He swore never to fall in love, until an alien touched his soul. What if love wasn't spoken, but sung? In a galaxy where touch reveals truth and silence can shatter worlds, a human xenolinguist arrives on an alien ocean world with one mission: observe, record, and never, ever get involved. But when he meets a mesmerizing alien woman bound by ritual and regret, his vow of detachment starts to fracture. This is not just a story of first contact, it's a story of first feeling, of resonance, a forbidden emotion vibrating beneath skin and soul, and of what happens when two hearts dare to echo one another in a world that punishes connection. If you're drawn to stories of sensual tension, emotional risk, and star-crossed souls who defy the rules of their worlds, you're in the right place. So settle in, breathe deep, and ask yourself, what would you risk to be truly understood? The shuttle doors hissed open with a sigh, releasing a breath of recycled air tinged with salt and ozone. Dr. Adrian Vale stepped into the blinding light of Luen, and for a heartbeat, he forgot how to breathe. The sky was not blue. It shimmered in shades of pearl and ink, streaked with gossamer clouds that pulsed like jellyfish. Two suns hung high above, one gold, one a deep lavender, casting criss-crossed shadows on the oceanic expanse that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The air was thick with moisture, carrying a low thrumming hum, like a distant chorus half sung by the planet itself. Adrian adjusted the strap of his field pack and squared his shoulders. 1 year. That was the agreement. 1 year embedded with the Luenian people, documenting their psychophonic language and emotional resonance traditions, then back to Earth. No distractions. No attachments. No exceptions. He had made a vow. A delegation stood waiting near the shuttle pad, tall, lithe beings cloaked in iridescent robes that moved like light through water. At their center stood a woman who wasn't cloaked at all. She was arresting. Her skin was dark as polished obsidian, etched with luminous fractal tattoos that spiraled from her cheekbones down to her collarbons. Her eyes were silver-laced violet, too wide, too deep, like looking into a storm. Her hair flowed in waves of navy and teal, braided with small singing shells that clicked softly with every movement. She did not smile. "You are Dr. Adrian Vale," she said, her voice low and melodious, vibrating faintly in his sternum. "We welcome you to Luen. I am Sirael of the Sixth Echo. I will be your guide." Adrian blinked, momentarily thrown. Yes. Thank you. It's an honor." He held out his hand instinctively. Sirael tilted her head, studying it like an alien artifact. "Humans still use physical contact for greetings?" she asked. "Touch, on Luen, is not casual. It is revelation." Adrian flushed and retracted his hand. "Right. Sorry. I'll remember that." "No offense taken," she said, though her expression remained unreadable. "We understand your species is still learning." Still learning. It stung more than it should have. She turned and gestured for him to follow. "Your quarters are prepared. You will reside within the Coral Archive. It is situated above the Singing Vaults, our oldest sonic memory chambers. You may find them overwhelming." Adrian fell into step beside her, careful not to walk too close. Her presence was oddly magnetic. Every movement she made was intentional, fluid, like she was always just on the edge of beginning a dance. Or a battle. "Have other humans stayed in the archive before me?" he asked, more to fill the silence than anything. "No," she said. "You are the first." He hesitated. Was that a mutual decision? She gave him a sidelong glance. "Our elders were reluctant. But you petitioned with great insistence. Earth officials claimed you were emotionally disciplined. Adrian huffed a dry laugh. That's one way of putting it. Do you agree? She asked. Are you closed? He faltered. That word, said so plainly, settled in his chest like a stone. I'm here to observe. To learn. Not to share. She nodded once, and the shells in her hair chimed gently. Then you may find Luen difficult. They walked the rest of the path in silence, save for the ambient hum that rose from the city itself, an ever-present song in the architecture, the wind, even the ground. Everything seemed to resonate, a living choir of vibration and memory. The coral archive emerged from the cliffside like a cathedral carved from iridescent bone. Translucent walls pulsed with soft blues and greens, breathing with the tide below. The entrance door opened not with a mechanical whir, but a low note, a musical tone that opened space itself. Inside, the air was denser. Fuller. Adrian paused at the threshold. The moment he crossed it, he felt it, a presence. A subtle vibration behind his eyes, like standing in front of a speaker just before it hums to life. Sirael watched him. The archive is alive. She listens. She remembers. Adrian cleared his throat, pretending not to shiver. Do you all speak in metaphor here? Sirael smiled faintly, and for the first time, it wasn't cryptic. It was amused. No. That was literal. His room was round, with a ceiling shaped like a nautilus shell, and a bed carved from coral silk that glowed faintly beneath him when he sat. Outside the balcony, 2 moons hovered low on the horizon, one dark and glassy, the other soft and silver. Sirael stood at the door, arms folded behind her back. You will begin orientation in the morning. For now, rest. The archive may dream beside you. Do I need to do anything? He asked. To greet her. Sirael tilted her head. She will know you by your silence, just as she will know you by your song. Adrian exhaled slowly, the weight of it all starting to settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just a new world. It was a new way of being. As Sirael turned to leave, she paused. And Dr. Vale, she said, her voice softer now, your vow of separation, it is yours to keep. But know this, on Luen, even silence makes music. And even the most distant soul hums when close enough to another. She vanished into the shimmering hallway. Adrian sat for a long time after that, listening to the quiet hum of the choral archive, a sound he would later realize was his own pulse, echoed back to him through ancient stone. He lay down, his hands folded over his chest, eyes fixed on the twin moons beyond the glass. He did not know it yet, but somewhere deep within the archive walls, the planet had begun to sing his name back. Adrian woke to light soft, bioluminescent, and rhythmic like the room was breathing in sync with him. He sat up slowly in the coral silk bed, the memory of Sirael's voice echoing in his mind. Even silence makes music. His dreams had been strange. He couldn't remember specifics, only a sensation, warm currents spiraling around his chest, whispers in an unintelligible harmony, and the feeling of being watched not with eyes, but with awareness. He touched his neck. Still alone. Still human. The coral floor beneath his bare feet was warm. Not like artificial heating, but like flesh warmed by blood. It pulsed faintly beneath him. Alive. He had slept in a building that breathed. After a quick rinse in the vapor fall chamber, no water on Luen, only aromatic mist, Adrian dressed in his earth-issued utility garb, charcoal slacks, tunic, boots. Efficient. Sterile. He looked like a museum exhibit labeled Homo sapiens, emotionally repressed edition. Outside, Sirael was waiting. She leaned casually against the wall, her robes replaced by a sleek blue-black bodysuit with bioluminescent thread weaving around her torso in fluid patterns. Her tattoos glowed faintly, matching the light pulse of the hallway. Adrian cleared his throat. "Good morning." Sirael nodded. "Your rhythm has steadied. The archive is pleased." He blinked. "It measures me?" "She listens," Sirael said. "You will learn." She didn't offer him breakfast. Instead, she led him down a winding corridor that resonated with soft musical tones underfoot. Every step they took echoed like notes in a slow, evolving melody. He followed, scanning the crystalline architecture with scientific interest and a touch of unease. "You mentioned yesterday that physical touch is revealing. Can you explain that?" Sirael stopped. They stood before a mural carved into the translucent wall, a series of overlapping silhouettes, human-like but elongated, each touching another at the chest, foreheads glowing. "Touch," she said, "is resonance. When skin meets skin, two frequencies merge. Not thoughts, not memories, but emotion, stripped of language. We feel what the other feels. It is not always pleasant. That sounds intimate." "It is sacred," she said, her tone quiet but firm. "There is no casual touch on Luen. Not with strangers. Not with curiosity. Only with trust." Adrian looked down at his own hands. How many times had he shaken a colleague's hand without thinking? Tapped someone's shoulder? Embraced in grief or joy without hesitation? "And what about accidents?" he asked. "What if it happens unintentionally?" "Then both are marked," she replied. "For a time, you echo one another. It fades. Usually. Usually." Sirael's lips curled, not quite into a smile. "Unless there is resonance. Then, it lingers." A shiver ran down his spine. "What does resonance feel like?" She met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw something raw in her expression, not flirtation, not superiority, but fragile memory. Like being sung by someone who doesn't know your melody, but somehow gets it right. The silence stretched. Adrian broke eye contact first. She moved again, continuing down the corridor. "Come. It is time you met the echo chamber." They entered a domed hall lined with vertical pools of what looked like mercury. Dozens of Luen neon figures stood along the perimeter, their fingers resting on the pool surfaces. The moment Adrian stepped in, the air shifted, charged, humming, listening. "What is this place?" he whispered. "Memory," Sirael replied. "Our people store memory not in books, but in vibration. These are our archivists. Each holds songs passed down through bloodlines." As if on cue, a soft choral tone rippled through the room. Adrian staggered slightly, overwhelmed by sudden emotion, a mixture of joy and sorrow so intense he couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. He clutched the side of a pillar. "What was that?" "A birth," Sirael said. "And a death." The echoes arrived at the same moment. Adrian looked at her, his voice low. "How do you live like this? With so much feeling, so exposed?" "We do not see it as exposure," she said. "We see it as truth." He shook his head. "Where I come from, people would call this chaotic. Uncontrolled. Dangerous." Sirael's silver eyes studied him carefully. "And yet your world burns. Quietly, from the inside." Adrian flinched. It wasn't an insult. It was an observation. A mirror held to a face long denied. He stepped back from the pillar, taking a slow breath, steadying himself. You really don't touch each other casually, he asked. Never, she said. Only once we are prepared to be seen. Adrian considered that. But what about partners? Lovers? How do you? Sirael stepped closer. So close he could feel the heat radiating from her skin. We sing to one another, she whispered. In silence or in voice. Our frequencies align. Our breath matches. Then we choose if we wish to merge. If we wish to touch. Her eyes held his like gravity. I do not touch you, Adrian Vale, she said, not because I do not wish to, but because I am not yet ready to be known by you. And just like that, she turned and walked away, leaving him breathless, his hands twitching with the urge to reach for something he didn't yet understand. The rain on Luen didn't fall. It sang. Adrian discovered this during his second night in the Coral Archive. He sat on the balcony, notebook in hand, trying to sketch the branching glyphs from the echo chamber, the ones that spiraled like neurons, when a soft, silver mist descended from the twin moons. Each drop struck the balcony like a bell. Ting. Tin. Ta-tin. A pattern. A rhythm. He leaned forward, brows furrowed. The rain wasn't random. It was, responding. Every time he exhaled, the pitch shifted. When his pulse quickened, the tempo adjusted. He checked his wrist monitor, heart rate rising. A response loop? No. Not a loop. Resonance. The archive was attuned to him. Or maybe, something else was. He stood, rain beating on his shoulders, mist curling through his hair. Slowly, almost reverently, he reached a hand into the open air, and the rain parted around his palm in a soft swirling halo. Adrian's breath caught. That's when he felt it. A hum in his chest, not sound, not pressure, but a presence. A subtle thrum, like a tuning fork struck deep in his ribs. It wasn't pain. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. He turned. Sirael stood at the edge of the balcony, watching him. She was barefoot, robed in flowing fabric that drank the moonlight, her tattoos glowing faintly under the rain's luminescent fall. Her expression was unreadable, not cold, not kind, just open, like a door barely cracked. How long have you been there? He asked. Long enough to hear your silence, she replied softly. Adrian stepped back under the overhang, embarrassed by how intimate it had felt out there, like he'd been naked in front of her, though fully clothed. The rain, he said. It reacts. It listens, she corrected. The archive senses shifts in vibration. When your mind begins to harmonize with her, she responds. So I'm sinking. Not yet, she said, approaching slowly. But you're beginning to hum. Adrian gave a nervous laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. You make it sound like I'm an instrument. Sirael tilted her head. Aren't we all? They stood in the half-light, the rain curling like breath around the balcony's edge. The silence between them was weighted now, alive. Something unsaid hung in the air, pulling at the edges of their words. I felt something, Adrian admitted. When you walked in. Before I saw you. Sirael nodded, stepping closer. So did I. Their eyes locked. Then, impossibly, a single tone began to rise, soft, crystalline, coming from nowhere and everywhere. Adrian looked around in alarm. Sirael didn't flinch. She's mirroring, she said. The archive is singing what we do not say. What are we saying? Adrian whispered. Sirael took one final step, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her. Close enough that her voice came as a breath against his lips. That we are not strangers anymore? His heart pounded in his throat. He wanted to touch her. Not out of lust, though it was there, undeniable, but out of the ache of understanding. She made him feel seen, and it terrified him. After everything he'd buried. After everything he'd lost. He swallowed hard. I'm not sure I'm ready. Sirael didn't move away. Then we won't? Not yet. On Luen, it is enough to stand close and listen. They stood like that for minutes, maybe hours, rain singing around them, archive harmonizing beneath them, hearts matching beat by beat. When they finally parted, no promises had been made. But something ancient had been heard. Adrian wandered the upper levels of the choral archive late that afternoon, restless. The sensation from the balcony hadn't left him. Not fully. It lingered in his chest like the aftertaste of thunder, something primal, low, and stirring. Even the walls seemed different now. When he walked past them, faint pulses of light followed his movements, like the archive was aware of him. Curious. Or was it someone else? He passed a doorway etched with symbols he hadn't seen before, spiraling glyphs that shimmered faintly with iridescent heat. The door was slightly ajar, the sound of soft music leaking through. A song without words. Fluid. Ethereal. It drew him in. Sirael, he called, hesitating. No response. The light beyond the door pulsed warmly, inviting. He stepped forward, curiosity overriding caution. Inside was a domed chamber bathed in dim sapphire light. A pool of liquid crystal rippled in the center, glowing from within. Dozens of vertical chimes hung from the ceiling, moving without wind, each releasing a subtle tone that wove into the ambient melody. In the center of the pool stood Sirael, submerged to her hips, her body bare and gleaming with moonlit condensation. Adrian froze. Her back was to him. The shifting glow of the water traced every curve, every scar, every rune-like marking down her spine. Her hair was unbound, cascading like a living wave, and her arms were lifted slightly, as if she were conducting the chamber itself. Then, she sang. No words. Just resonance. Low, guttural notes that vibrated deep in Adrian's bones, a sound not meant for human ears, but something older. Intimate. Sacred. He realized too late. This wasn't a bath. It was a ritual. Sirael turned slowly, her silver-violet eyes wide, shining with trance and fury. What are you doing here? She said, the music halting mid-breath. The room stilled. The tones stopped. Adrian raised both hands. I didn't mean I thought the door was open. Sirael moved through the water like a serpent, the liquid parting for her. She stopped just shy of the edge, chest still submerged, arms trembling. You don't understand what you've walked into, she said, voice low and shaking. This was a calling. A communion with the archive. I didn't know. I swear I thought I heard you. You heard me, because you've started to echo, she snapped, and for the first time, her voice was sharp. Not playful. Not mysterious. But raw. Wounded. Adrian's breath hitched. Echo. Sirael stared at him, breathing hard. You're inside me now, she said. Not physically. Harmonically. Every moment you're near me, I feel it. A pull. A mirror. A temptation. He took a step back, ashamed. I didn't mean to. But you did, she whispered, cutting him off. You walked through a marked threshold. During a private ritual. Do you know what that means in our culture? He shook his head slowly, throat tight. No. Sirael's voice dropped to a tremble. It means you've seen me at my most open. My most bare. It means the archive now recognizes you as a witness to my song. He couldn't breathe. Does that change something? He asked, barely able to get the words out. Yes, she said, the pain in her eyes undeniable. It means I can't lie to you anymore. Not even in silence. A long silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, carefully, she stepped from the water. Fluid beaded on her skin like stardust. She wrapped herself in a sheer ceremonial robe from a nearby pedestal, her movements stiff with hurt. But she didn't look away. You want to understand Luen, she said, voice hoarse. Then understand this, to us, vulnerability is the highest form of trust. And you took it without asking. Adrian looked at her, this proud, radiant woman, barely veiled, breathing hard, eyes alight with something that could have been rage, or desire. I didn't come here to take anything, he said, heart pounding. But maybe I came here needing to be broken open. Sirael blinked, caught off guard. You don't get to say that, she whispered. Not yet. Then she turned and vanished through a second archway, leaving only the rippling water behind, and the stunned silence of the room, which no longer sang. Adrian stood there, alone, soaked in guilt and awe. He hadn't touched her. But something had shifted between them, irrevocably. And the archive knew it. Adrian couldn't sleep. The walls of the choral archive, once a curious hum of ambient song, now seemed to whisper things he couldn't quite hear, not in words, but in memory. His body buzzed with restless energy, like he'd stepped into a frequency not meant for humans and couldn't tune out. He kept seeing her. Sirael, in the sacred pool. Her body bathed in glow. Her voice carrying pain, and something worse, trust, bruised. He hated himself for stepping into that room. But worse than a shame was the realization that he'd wanted to see her. Wanted to understand. To feel what she felt. And now, it was happening. Whether he liked it or not. The echo wasn't going away. Whenever he closed his eyes, he felt her. Her breath, a tremor at the edge of his ribs. Her emotion, like a ripple just beneath his skin. Not memories. Not thoughts. Just presence. And it terrified him. Because it wasn't fading. By the third night, he cracked. He left his chamber barefoot, guided by instinct more than logic, weaving through the crystalline halls like a man sleepwalking. The archive pulsed with soft light underfoot, leading him, as if it already knew where he needed to go. He found her at the edge of the sea. Sirael stood on a narrow ridge of coral that jutted into the moonlit waves, her robe billowing in a salt-kissed wind. The twin moons hung above her, one silver, one shadowed, casting twin reflections on the water's skin. She didn't turn as he approached. "You've been quiet," she said. "I didn't think I had the right to speak," Adrian murmured. "You didn't," she replied, her voice like a thread of smoke. "But I hear you anyway. Every time your heart stutters, I feel it in my bones." He stopped beside her, eyes on the horizon. "Is that the echo?" "No," she said. "That's you." They stood in silence, the water sighing around their ankles. Somewhere out in the shallows, glowing creatures danced just beneath the surface, bioluminescent serpents or eels, painting the waves in slow, sweeping arcs of emerald and gold. Adrian finally turned to face her. What happens now? Sirael's gaze didn't move from the sea. Now, we make a choice. To let this fade, or to let it deepen. He swallowed. Would you let it deepen? She turned to him slowly. The look in her eyes stole the air from his lungs. I would, she said. But not lightly. Not with someone afraid of being known. He stepped closer, just enough to feel the warmth radiating off her skin. I'm not afraid of you. You are, she whispered. Because I see you. I see the ache you carry. The vow wrapped around your heart like wire. Adrian flinched. Don't. Sirael stepped closer, her voice gentle now. You keep pretending you came here to study us. But I've heard the silence in your soul, Adrian Vale. You came here to disappear. He looked down. Maybe I did. And yet, she said, reaching up not to touch him, but to hover her hand near his chest, here you are. Echoing. Their breaths synced without trying. A single drop of rain fell between them. Then another. A soft beginning. Sirael tilted her head, a slow, knowing smile blooming on her lips. Do you want to learn how to flirt in our way? Adrian's brow furrowed. What? Human courtship, she said. You mentioned it in the archive. Teasing. Seduction. I want to understand. His heart hammered. Sirael. She stepped in, close enough that their chests almost touched. Teach me, Adrian. Show me how humans fall. He reached up slowly, trembling, and tucked a strand of her dark blue hair behind her ear. Her eyes fluttered closed at the whisper of contact. Flirting, he murmured, is anticipation. A dance. It's about staying close, but not quite touching. Cruel, she whispered, her lips inches from his. Delicious, he corrected, brushing his knuckles along her jaw. The air between them thickened, dense with unspoken hunger. I thought you weren't ready to be known, she breathed. I'm ready to know you, he said. Maybe that's how it begins. The archive pulsed beneath her feet, a low harmonic that resonated in Adrian's chest like the start of a song. And though their lips never met, the energy between them was electric, coiled and humming, like the pause before a first kiss, before a storm. Before surrender. The archive screamed. Not in sound, but in vibration. Adrian shot upright in his bed, heart racing, as the crystal walls around him pulsed a frantic red. The normally gentle harmonics of the choral archive had shifted into jagged, dissonant chords, like a symphony being shattered. Breach, the archive's inner voice intoned. Unauthorized entry. Evacuate to resonance shelters. He was already moving. His boots slammed onto the floor, hands fumbling for his coat and COMM link. But it didn't connect, just static. He cursed under his breath, grabbing the emergency signal flare and a small field knife from his pack. Then the walls shook. A boom, deep and organic, rattled through the floor like the heartbeat of some wounded titan. Coral fractures spidered along the ceiling. Something was attacking the archive from beneath. He was halfway down the corridor when he felt her. That echo in his ribs. Panic. Sharp. Focused. Hers. Sirael. He sprinted. The corridors twisted and bent like melted glass under stress. Lights flickered. Song fragments garbled. One wall spat a warning glyph in crimson light. Structural breach imminent. He turned a corner and nearly slammed into her. Sirael's eyes were wide, her bodysuit torn along one arm, blood trickling down her shoulder. Her tattoos pulsed erratically, like they couldn't stabilize her rhythm. Adrian, she breathed, grabbing his arm. Her fingers burned. You shouldn't be here. What's happening? No time raiders. Deep water insurgents. They breached the reef wall. The archive is a target. Why? Because it holds ancestral resonance patterns. If corrupted, they can rewrite entire bloodlines. Adrian blinked. They are here to steal identity? Sirael nodded grimly, already pulling him into motion. There's a resonance vault beneath the eastern wing. It's shielded. Come. Another quake slammed the floor, sending them sprawling. A spire of crystal cracked and fell inches from Adrian's shoulder. The air split with static and low-frequency howls, like underwater screams. He looked up. The ceiling fractured, and water began to pour through. Sirael yanked him to his feet, dragging him down a side passage just as the hallway behind them flooded. They ran in soaked silence, their hands clutching each other so tightly it burned. They made it to the vault with seconds to spare. The chamber sealed shut behind them with a clang, cutting off the chaos. Inside, it was dim, silent, a circular room lined with harmonic conduits and bioluminescent coral spirals. But Adrian barely noticed. Sirael collapsed to her knees, trembling. Her arm was slick with blood, her breath coming in ragged bursts. He dropped beside her. You're hurt, he said. Let me. Don't touch me, she gasped. Not yet. My field's destabilized. If you touch me now, you'll feel everything. Too much. It could crush you. He froze. But watching her tremble, watching her suffer alone, he couldn't. Not again. Not her. I don't care, he whispered, voice tight. Let me in. Her eyes met his, glowing, unguarded, afraid. Adrian, if you enter resonance with me in this state, you'll know everything I have hidden. Everything I am. The pain, the guilt, the hunger. I want to, he said. Not as a scientist. Not as a guest. As a man who loved her, even if he hadn't said it yet. He reached out slowly, deliberately, and placed his palm against the bare skin of her chest, over the spiral tattoo at her heart. The effect was instant. A surge of heat. A crackling snap like electricity crossing bone. Then nothing but feeling. Her memories slammed into him, not as images, but as tides of emotion. A childhood of discipline, forced silence. Her first love, and his betrayal when she rose higher in rank. The terror of leadership. The weight of being seen as a symbol. The loneliness. The night she first saw Adrian arrive, the tiny flicker of hope. The guilt of wanting something forbidden. He gasped. His knees buckled. But her arms were around him now, pulling him down, and his forehead pressed to hers as if instinct knew what language could not. Their frequencies aligned, one breath, one heart, one thrum. The room vibrated around them, not in alarm, but in harmony. Then, calm. The archive fell into hush. And Sirael, still trembling, whispered, Now you know. Adrian, dazed and overwhelmed, managed only this. I'm not afraid of who you are. Her breath hitched. And then she kissed him. Not desperate. Not soft. But real. A kiss that said thank you and forgive me and don't go. A kiss that was permission, not possession. And when their lips parted, she laid her forehead against his chest and whispered into his skin. I was never supposed to want you. Adrian closed his eyes, holding her tighter. I was never supposed to stay. But here they were. In the dark. In danger. And neither one could walk away now. The world outside the vault had changed. When the emergency seal finally lifted, it revealed a version of the coral archive half drowned and half silent. Crystalline walls were cracked, once glowing conduits flickered weakly, and the musical hum that had filled every hall with life was now off-key. Wounded. Like a throat after a scream. Adrian stood in the ruined corridor, his hand still clasped with Sirael's. Neither had spoken since the vault opened. Their bodies hummed with a lingering resonance of the shared merge, quiet now, but alive beneath the skin. He could feel her even without looking. She was a note inside him, vibrating gently against his ribs. It wasn't just emotional. It was biological. Sirael, he said softly, what did we do? She was staring ahead, her expression unreadable. Her usual poise, the effortless elegance, the teasing restraint, had given way to something bare. Something tired. We created a bond, she said. Without intention. Without ceremony. But still, real. Adrian's heart pounded. Is it permanent? I don't know. She turned to face him fully. You're not Luenian. This has never been tested between species. They walked in silence through the archive's wreckage. The bodies of fallen defenders had already been collected. Cracked walls tried to heal themselves. The city's pulse was faint, uncertain, like it was holding its breath. At the upper chamber, two figures waited. Elder Nixon, ancient and silent, his skin like transparent quartz. Beside him, a woman with white-plaited hair and eyes like steel, Marshal Alrine, the chief voice of the Council's Defense Guild. Sirael straightened instinctively. Adrian felt her breath hitch, just slightly. They had been summoned. Step forward, Alrine said. Adrian obeyed. Sirael followed. Nixon raised a hand, and the archive's harmonic field fell into stillness. All around them, echoes ceased. No sound. No vibration. Only judgment. You engaged in resonance during a time of crisis, Alrine said. Without clearance. Without containment. And across species lines. Sirael spoke first. We had no choice. He was injured. I was destabilized. We needed harmony to survive the vault collapse. That is not the issue, Alrine snapped. The issue is what it triggered. Nixon opened his palm, revealing a glowing orb of liquid song. The room dimmed as the sphere played back a fractured memory, not visual, but emotional. A resonance echo from the chamber below. Adrian heard it. Sirael's ache. His longing. The merging. It was all there. Compressed into a haunting thrum of shared vulnerability. A memory that belonged to them, broadcast through the archive. Adrian's gut turned to ice. You recorded us. We felt you, Nixon said, voice like glass rubbed smooth. The archive is alive, Dr. Vale. When you touched one of its stewards, it recorded what was born between you. Alrine stepped forward, face taut. Do you understand what you've done? A cross-resonance of that strength destabilizes our harmonic grid. It sets precedents. Others will try to echo with outsiders. Untrained. Unsafe. I didn't ask for this, Adrian said, voice shaking. But I won't apologize for surviving. And I won't apologize for feeling, Sirael said, stepping forward now, spine straight. He didn't force this. I didn't either. The archive chose to sing us into each other. Who are we to deny its voice? Alrin's expression twisted. You were supposed to be a diplomat, not a bondmate. Nixon studied Sirael with eyes that seemed to look through time. There is precedent for union across divergence, though none in recent history. Alrin's face darkened. You'd risk destabilizing our society because of a crush on a human? Sirael said nothing. She didn't have to, because her fingers slid into Adrian's. Their joined hands made the silence deafening. Nixon closed his palm. The archive speaks, he said. And she does not condemn. Alrin looked as if she'd bitten into something sour. Then what is your judgment? Nixon turned to Adrian. You may stay. Adrian blinked. What? You are changed now, Nixon said. You echo. You resonate. You cannot go back to silence. Then he turned to Sirael. But understand, this bond will mark you. The archive may forgive. The council may forget. But the people, they will not. Sirael nodded slowly. I know. Alrin looked between them. And what happens when this human leaves? When his mission ends and he returns to Earth? Adrian spoke, his voice firmer than he expected. Maybe Earth isn't home anymore? Sirael looked at him, really looked, and something unreadable flickered in her gaze. Hope. Or fear. Or both. They were dismissed with no ceremony. As they stepped back into the archive's corridors, the world still recovering around them, Adrian stopped her. I meant it, he said. About staying. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I'm not done being near you. Sirael exhaled slowly, her shoulders rising and falling like waves. I don't know what we've become, she said. But I know this, I don't want to undo it. They stood together in the broken hall, surrounded by damage, by consequence. Yet in each other's eyes, something fragile and growing had survived the fall. The heat arrived with no warning. One moment, Adrian was standing in the upper observation ring of the archive, watching engineers rebuild broken resonance conduits. The next, the air rippled, not with song, but with pressure, like a throat clenching before a scream. The suns flared through the clouds outside. Then came the fire. It didn't fall from the sky. It rose from the sea. Great plumes of crimson mist erupted from the lower reef canyons, fire-tainted steam churning into the city's crystalline supports. The coral archive began to wail, harmonic frequencies fracturing into discordant shrieks. Adrian clutched the railing as the floor pitched. Below, dozens of Luen workers stumbled, shouting over one another. Emergency glyphs flared on every wall. Tectonic destabilization. Heat breach. Source, external. Hostile activity detected. He bolted into motion, one thought echoing through every step. Sirael. He found her at the central harmonic hub, the hard glass chamber, hands splayed against a glowing column of memory reef, her eyes locked in trance. Her tattoos flickered violently, like a system on the verge of overload. Sirael, he shouted, grabbing her shoulders. Her eyes snapped open, wild, glowing with heat and panic. You shouldn't be here, she gasped. The frequencies are corrupted. Someone's weaponized resonance. Adrian felt it now, a low-pitched hum in the back of his skull, too low to be heard, but powerful enough to make his teeth ache. The archive was being hijacked, its own songs turned against it. Who's doing this? He demanded. Sirael's mouth tightened. Kalen. Adrian blinked. Who? My former bondmate, she said, voice like ice. He disappeared a year ago after the elders dissolved our pairing. I thought he vanished. But he's not gone, he's in the deep. And now, he's striking back. Adrian reeled. Because of us. Her silence said everything. The archive shook again. And then something else shifted, not just outside, but inside Adrian. A heat bloomed in his chest. It wasn't fear. It was her. Sirael, he said quietly, something's happening to me? She turned, staring at him. Her brows furrowed. Then her lips parted. Oh. He could feel it now, the connection between them, tighter than before. Her panic raced under his skin. Her temperature spiked. His pulse matched hers. Adrian, your resonance is stabilizing with mine, she whispered. Without intention. Without contact. He took a step back, breathing hard. Is that bad? She nodded. It's impossible. They stared at each other across the echoing chamber, the floor glowing between them like a live wire. The fire outside painted the walls in shifting amber shadows. Everything was collapsing. And yet, all he could think about was her. How she looked right now, radiant and terrified. Her chest rising with each breath he could feel in his own lungs. The tension between them no longer teasing, no longer intellectual, but cellular. He moved toward her before he could stop himself. Sirael, he said hoarsely, tell me not to. Her eyes shimmered. I can't. He reached for her. Not with caution. With need. This time when their hands met, there was no psychic explosion. No jolt. Just home. Their bodies found each other like matching frequencies, not violent, not frantic, but aching and inevitable. Their lips met. The kiss was everything they hadn't dared say. And everything they'd already felt. It was heat and harmony, fire and forgiveness, a merging of defiance and desire. She pressed him against the memory column, and he didn't resist. Her fingers found his jaw, his ribs, the small of his back. His hands schemed the lines of her spine, tracing the tattoos that now pulsed in sync with his own heartbeat. There was no logic left. Only sound. Only flame. And then, a scream ripped through the archive. Not Sirael. Not Adrian. The archive itself. The memory reef turned black beneath her touch. Adrian gasped, pulling away. What did we do? Sirael stared in horror. He's hijacking the bond, she whispered. Kalen is inside the resonance now. He felt us connect. Adrian's stomach dropped. He's using us. No, she said. He's targeting you. Suddenly, alarms howled. A wall fractured open. And from the molten smoke stepped Kalen, tall, luminous, and twisted by rage. I see you've chosen your echo, Sirael, he snarled. Let's see if it survives the shatter. The chamber darkened. Kalen stepped through smoke like a storm carved into flesh, tall, luminescent, and marked by fractured resonance tattoos that shimmered wrong, pulsing out of sync with the archive's rhythm. His eyes were pale, stripped of softness. A man built from rejection. He didn't look at Adrian. He looked only at Sirael. You broke the harmony, he said. For him. Sirael stood between them, chest heaving, body taut like a drawn bowstring. You left, she said. You severed the bond yourself. Kalen's laugh was sharp and bitter. I severed the performance. Not the tie. Not the claim. Adrian stepped forward. She's not something to be claimed, At last, Kalen turned. His gaze settled on Adrian like a slow poison. "You're trembling," he said coolly. "That's how resonance begins to crack. Shall we see how far you'll break, little Earthborn?" The archive pulsed around them, reacting, responding. A glyph ignited on the floor between them, a circle of truth song. Sirael's eyes widened. "No. You can't." Kalen raised a hand, and the circle flared. "I challenge," he said, voice echoing with authority, "the outsider for the right of final resonance. Trial by shatter." The archive sealed the chamber. The walls fell away into sound. Adrian stood on one side of the circle, Kalen on the other, and in the center, a tower of harmonic crystal. Sirael was locked outside now, her fist slamming against the barrier of pure vibration. "You don't have to do this," she shouted. Adrian didn't answer. Because he already knew, he did. He stepped into the circle. The resonance struck like lightning. Pain bloomed through his chest, not physical, emotional. The crystal pillar flickered with every heartbeat, reacting to what lived deepest inside him. Kalen spoke first. His voice was cold thunder. "Let the outsider show himself. Let him sing." Adrian closed his eyes. And let go. What came wasn't words. It was grief. The death of his wife. The years spent locked inside silence. The shame of survival. The vow to never love again, a wall built high and proud. The archive lit with it, a shimmering blue wave that washed over the crystal. Kalen sneered. "You lead with sorrow. How fitting. Now let me show her what passion is." His voice boomed into the space, lust and anger and memory laced into the tone. The crystal cracked. Adrian staggered, knees buckling. "You can't win this," Kalen growled. "You're a man made of fracture. You echo only your own emptiness." Adrian's fingers dug into the floor. His heart screamed. But then he heard her. Sirael. On the other side of the barrier, she had begun to hum. Softly. Wordlessly. A note only he would recognize. The one they'd first shared under moonlight. The one that made his ribs thrum and his chest ache. And suddenly, he was not empty. He stood. And he sang. Not in words, but in emotion. The quiet safety of her touch. The spark of curiosity that became fire. The way her voice made silence meaningful. The way she knew his pain, and did not look away. Love, unexpected, uninvited, but real. The crystal flared gold. Kalen screamed as the circle fractured beneath him, energy lashing against his mind like a storm of mirrors. He collapsed, clutching his chest, overwhelmed by Adrian's resonance, not because it was stronger, but because it was honest. The archive shattered the trial seal. The song ended. Sirael rushed forward as Kalen lay gasping on the floor, defeated. Adrian dropped to one knee, drenched in sweat, pulse erratic, hands trembling, but still humming inside. Still whole. Sirael knelt beside him. "You did it," she whispered. He looked up at her with dazed eyes. "No," he said, voice breaking. "We did." She kissed him, not with fire, but with peace. Around them, the archive sang its approval. A low, warm chord of union. Not because they'd fought, but because they had dared to feel. It took 3 days for the archive to quiet. 3 days of tremors, flickering light, erratic tones pulsing through the walls like memories trying to find their place again. Adrian didn't leave Sirael's side. Not during the restoration. Not during the council's silent assessments. Not even when Kalen was taken away, stripped of rank, his resonance mark sealed by the elders. The man who had once claimed Sirael now echoed only himself. And that silence was his sentence. They sat together in the still recovering hard glass chamber, the column of crystal now whole again, though thinner. Softer. It would never sound quite the same. Neither would they. Adrian cradled a warm shell of synth tea between his palms, watching as the twin moons rose outside the crystalline dome. One golden, one silver, always chasing each other across the sky. Sirael leaned into him, her head on his shoulder, her body warm and familiar now. They didn't need to speak. They'd said everything without language. But still, he turned and whispered. "Do you regret it?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for his hand, not tentatively now, but fully, and wove her fingers between his. "I've lived my entire life echoing others," she said quietly. "What they wanted me to be. How they needed me to sound." She looked up at him, eyes shimmering with violet warmth. "You were the first dissonance I ever loved." He smiled, tired and honest. "I don't know what comes next." "I do," she said. She stood, pulling him to his feet, and walked to the center of the chamber where the memory crystal hummed with a low, expectant thrum. Sirael placed her hand on the surface. A new glyph flared into existence. Adrian stared as it glowed, two spiraling frequencies, entwined but distinct. "It's a binding," she said. "Not a claim. A promise. The archive is asking if you want to stay. Not as a researcher. Not as a guest. As a bonded echo." Adrian's throat tightened. It wasn't marriage. It wasn't ownership. It was something deeper. The archive didn't record contracts. It recorded truth. He stepped forward, placed his hand over hers, and the glyph flared gold. Their joint pulse shimmered through the chamber. Outside, the moons aligned in the sky, not a celestial event, just a natural dance of Luen. But to Adrian, it felt like a sign. Like the universe had listened, and responded. The song that rose was not one he recognized. Because it had never been sung before. It was theirs. Later that night, they walked the coral bridge across the tide pools, wind warm against their skin. Sirael reached out and touched his heart, just gently, and he knew what she meant. Not "I love you." Not "don't leave." But, "You are home." Adrian pulled her close, resting his forehead to hers. "I never thought I'd fall in love again," he said. "Especially not with someone who could hear everything I didn't say." Sirael smiled. "That's the best part." They stood there beneath the twin moons, two hearts humming in unison. And above them, far beyond the clouds and currents, the stars began to shimmer. Just slightly. Like they, too, were learning how to sing. Somewhere out there, beneath twin moons and stars that remember, a human and an alien found something no archive could predict, a bond that sings louder than fear. But this story isn't just theirs, it echoes in anyone who's ever felt like a stranger in their own skin, and dared to reach for someone anyway. What did this story make you feel? Would you choose truth if it meant shattering silence? Could you love someone who hears everything you never say? Let me know in the comments below. Because the most powerful resonance doesn't come from the stars. It comes from you.